We had some wind from this tropical storm come through, knocked most of the walnuts off of this tree. And so it's a good opportunity to showcase this tool. You can see how easy it is. I'm one-handed here. I'm holding the camera and wheeling this thing around with the other hand. They call this tool the Nut Wizard. There's lots of different places online you can get it. You can get it at some hardware stores. Comes with this nifty little, hold on. Can you guys tell what's going on here? See how we're kind of opening those bottom tines with this little attachment on the bucket. So anyway, I'm gonna go through here and sweep up many of these walnuts as I can. As you can probably tell by the color of my hands, it is walnut season out here. Black walnut specifically. There's a few of these black walnut trees behind me. There's the one there, this one, and this one, all black walnut. There's also a chestnut tucked in here. I've talked about these trees, specifically these four before, just right next to the house here. And so I have a lot to say about black walnut. It's one of my favorite trees. What I think I'm gonna do is I'll do a quick little introduction to black walnut for those of you who may not be super familiar with these trees, a little bit about why I like them, what they're all about. Quickly, I'm gonna hop into most of what I wanna talk about in this video today is how to actually process the black walnut, how to take, let's see, find a nut. How to go from something like this to a nut that you can actually enjoy eating. And how long this video goes, I wanna talk about growing black walnut trees from seed as well, but that might come at the end, or it might have to be its own separate video if this goes on for too long. We'll just have to see. From the East Coast or the Midwest, you're probably familiar with these trees. You've probably seen them around. Maybe you recognize their leaves. Maybe you recognize the nuts or the bark. They do really well all the way from northern Florida up pretty far into the Northeast and into the Midwest as well. Some areas, they behave like an early successional tree. They need a lot of sunlight. They're fast growers. They might be some of the first trees to, take over an abandoned field or area. They have a deep taproot. A lot of folks know them for their compound that they produce called jungalone. It's in a lot of the parts of the plant. It's in the tissue of the wood, the roots, it's in the leaves, it's in the husk of the nut. This is a compound that has gotten a lot of attention in the media. I don't want to spend too much time on it here because I've made a separate video dedicated just to talking about this compound, jungalone, and its toxicity. That's the main thing that, if you're not familiar, that folks talk about, is that this compound can have a negative impact on other plants. It can kill other plants, it can harm other plants. We see this in the lab. We don't really see it as much in nature. If you look around, like I talked about in that video, which you can check out, there's, let's see, bushes, grass, there's all sorts of stuff that can grow just fine with black walnut. A lot of people will tell you that nothing grows under them, that they kill all plants. That's not true. They can have a negative impact on certain types of plants. I don't want to dismiss it entirely, but don't get too caught up in worrying if you have black walnut trees or if you plant them, it's going to kill all your other plants. A lot of times you'll run into people that will tell you that their black walnut tree killed XYZ plant that they had in their yard. And I'm not going to say that that's never true. Maybe there are cases where that might be true, but most of the time I think it's people just, a plant dies, they want to put the blame on something, so they blame the black walnut. I work with these trees a lot. I don't really ever see it to be a problem in the ways that I work with them. There have been several studies looking at the effect of black walnut in silvopasture systems with grasses where they want the grass to be productive as a feed for livestock. And they have found that with black walnuts at appropriate spacing so that there's still good sunlight penetration into the grass, a few black walnuts in a pasture actually promotes more grass growth than with none at all. So it's not as simple as black walnuts kill any plants. Anyway, like I said, I don't want to dwell on that too long. They're really well known for the quality of their wood. It's a rot-resistant wood, but it has a really beautiful color and texture and grain. And so it's highly valued for furniture making and other, woodworking projects. The husk, the leaves, a lot of parts of the tree, they have an antimicrobial, antibacterial effect. So it can be turned into medicine for humans. Some folks like to plant them in their pastures because, there's this idea that the livestock will graze on the leaves and the husks some, and they'll get a bit of a deworming effect going on. I haven't seen any, rigorous studies on that. I'm not sure. Maybe it has been studied. I don't know. It makes a lot of sense to me. So, but that's definitely another thing that they're known for, is that antibiotic compound in the leaves. But the real reason that I like them so much is the nut that they produce, which is inside of this husk here. This is what they look like. There's a tremendous amount of variation in the husk size and shape amongst all the wild trees. Every seedling is going to be incredibly unique, and so they can be more kind of pointy at the top. They can be much smaller, much larger. That variation also applies to the size of the nut, both the shell thickness, the size of the actual kernel inside of the nut, the taste of the nut. There's tremendous variation amongst wild black walnut populations. If you've ever worked with the walnuts before, one just fell behind me. I don't know if you guys heard that. If you've ever worked with them before, you may be familiar with the fact they are a lot of work to get them out of the husk and out of the shell. To me, it's incredibly worth it because the taste of the black walnut, it's a taste you're not going to get anywhere else. There's nothing quite like a black walnut. They have a walnutty taste like the walnuts you get at the store, but there's much more going on. It's more nuanced. To me, there's like a floral, fruity, kind of sweet something going on. It's very intense. It's very strong, and I love it. It's possibly my favorite nut to eat. I hesitate. Hickory is also really high up there. Some of the hickories taste really good, but I love the black one. I love eating them raw. I love putting them into baked goods. Also incredibly good for you. The black walnut is the highest protein content of any tree nut out there in the world. It's very high in the healthy fats. It has a lot of the minerals and vitamins that you need in it. I've heard some folks say it has a similar nutritional profile to ground beef. So it's a lot of protein and fat just falling from the sky. And the cool thing is, on the East Coast, they're everywhere. There are black walnut trees everywhere. They drop tons of food, and most of us just ignore it and leave it on the ground. Wildlife, squirrels and such do need some of that food. We don't want to collect all of the nuts across the whole everywhere, right? Just for ourselves. We want to leave some for the critters, but there's a lot more than just the squirrels need that drops on the ground. And we could, as a society, as a culture, we could really benefit, I think, from utilizing more of these nuts in our diet. Think about such a high protein, fat, mineral source that also tastes amazing. And it grows here without any care. These trees are not getting fertilized. They're not being sprayed with pesticides. They're just well adapted here. They produce a crop without almost any help from us. So I think there's a lot of benefits to working with these trees. Now the meat of the matter, how do you actually go about, like I said, getting the nut out of here? It's a lot of work. So there's two things I do want to talk about. If you have almost no equipment, you're just at your house, in your backyard, what can you do to get yourself some food, some free food from nature? I want to talk about that. And then also at a bit larger of a scale, if we, as a culture, if we really want to start using these more, there are ways that we can make that labor of getting the nut out much more efficient with some small pieces of equipment, some cooperative scale, ag equipment basically, that we'll talk about in a minute. You can pick them up by hand. Anytime you're picking up things off the ground, it's a lot of bending over, which is not great. I don't love bending over. It's part of why I don't love vegetable farming and why I like perennials more. But when you pick them up off the ground by hand, there's a lot of bending over. That's fine. It is fun, I think, to pick them up by hand. There's something just feels right about that. But they make these tools called a nut wizard, and they are really efficient at picking up the nuts. There's a little gadget it comes with to empty them into a bucket really quickly. And when the nuts are really thick on the ground and you have one of those roller nut wizard things, you can pick up a 5-gallon bucket of nuts in no time at all with no bending over. It's very easy. So picking them up, very, very easy, very pleasant. A lot of different ways you can get them out of the husk. That's the next step, and you do want to do that relatively soon. You don't want to let them sit around in the husk for too long. At all stages in this process, you've got to be worried about squirrels stealing your nuts. Like I said, you do want to leave some for the squirrels, but if you don't protect some of yours, you won't have any. They will take them all. And so you do have to be aware of that. I prefer to use the paint mixer and the drill method, which I'll show here on screen somewhere. Basically, the idea is you get a bunch of these walnuts, you put them in some sort of container, a bucket, a 55-gallon drum, whatever. You fill it with water, and then you get a corded drill with a lot of torque, and you get a paint mixer bit, and you just beat the snot out of those nuts for a few minutes with that bit. And that's going to pulverize all the husk, basically turn it into a slurry, a liquid, and then you can pour that container out, spray down all the nuts, and you can pick all the nuts out. All the husk will just kind of get washed away with the water in the hose. I know you can do it by hand, and I'll show that too. You can just kind of just mush them apart with your hands. Like I showed in the beginning, they will stain your hands. The stain will last 4 weeks. So if you don't want stained hands, I advise you to wear gloves for that part. You can stomp on them with the heel of your boot or shoe. That's a pretty good method to get the husk out, is just stomp on them. A lot of folks will leave them in the driveway, run them over with their car. There's other methods, but that's basically the way that I like to do. I like to use, if I'm just doing it by myself, either by hand. I'll sit there and I can get through a 5-gallon bucket in like, I don't know, 10-15 minutes or so. It's pretty pleasant. If I've got multiple buckets full of nuts, I will use the paint mixer and the drill method, because it's just a little bit faster when you're dealing with that quantity of nuts. Once they're out of the husk, you need to cure them and dry them pretty effectively, pretty efficiently, kind of right away. You don't want them to sit around wet for too long. You also don't want them to dry out too fast. So I don't recommend sticking them out in the full blazing sun. If you stack them out, just one layer of nuts, you don't want nuts sitting on top of each other, but just one layer of nuts out flat. Anywhere where there's good airflow, whether it's outside or in a garage with a fan, that'll get them dried down. Give them a week at least like that, preferably like, 2 to 3 weeks of laying out flat to fully dry and cure. At that point, they're ready to eat. Now, the husking is a lot of work if you're doing it by hand, like I said. So folks have designed black walnut husking machines. People have modified tractor implements. People have rigged up machines like with a tire. I got a friend who just built a machine I'll show here on the screen. And so there are ways to mechanize this that are relatively inexpensive. They're very simple. We can utilize materials, tools that we have lying around and make this stuff work. Every farm does not need its own dehusking, dehulling equipment. This is stuff that communities can share. There's lots of good models for this out there. There's small cooperatives that exist in various parts of the East Coast and the Midwest. There's one large outfit you may be aware of called Hammond's. They're the largest purchaser of wild black walnuts. They have hulling stations all across the Midwest. You bring your nuts. They pay you a price based on the pounds, how many pounds of nuts you bring them. They'll husk them, they'll pay you. Some of the other cooperatives will trade you. You bring them nuts and they'll trade you back cracked walnuts later. They'll husk them and crack them and all that, and they'll give you a percentage of the harvest as return for the nuts that you brought them. And so I just want to expose folks to the idea that equipment exists. And that's the direction that I want to see things going as far as, working with black walnut. I want to see more cooperatives come online. I want to see I feel like everybody within a 30, 40, maybe 50-minute driving radius of where they're at with their walnut trees should have access to a facility that can husk the nuts without all this labor. I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that. It would not take a whole lot. Once they're cured and dried in the shell, they will last for years if they're kept at room temperature and, protected from rodents. That's always something you got to worry about with nuts. They'll last for years. So this really is can be a survival food, right? You can put it away and store it for a long time in case times get hard. Also, like I said, it's a very enjoyable food to eat. It's very, I like eating them, even if I don't need to survive. I love eating them. So they'll last a long time if you store them. Cracking is another part where, like I said, equipment can help. Large scale or community scale equipment can really help. But if you don't have access to that, like most of us don't, they do make specialty black walnut crackers that are designed to crack the black. It has such a thick shell, you can't crack it in a regular nut cracker. You need something specially designed for black walnuts. So for using a cracker in the kitchen, I like to get one of these dedicated black walnut crackers, which I'll show here on the screen as well. That's really how I prefer to do it. It's just pleasant to work with that way. But if you don't have that, if you don't feel like dropping the money on it, they are like $100. You can crack them with a hammer and a rock very well. I'll put some of that on screen as well. The way that you orient the nut and the way that you swing the hammer, you can get really effective at it. You don't want to just smash down the hammer as hard as you can with all your weight. The nut will shatter and go flying all over the place. But cracking the nuts is not very labor intensive. It's more time intensive. Okay. In other words, it's not very strenuous on the body, but it takes a lot of time to crack each individual nut. A lot of the times the little pieces of the nut kernel, the nut meat, don't want to come out of the shell very easily. So you got to have some tweezers or crack each individual little piece of the nut separately. So that it just can take a lot of time. And that's where, again, folks have come up with designs to have like a, industrial scale, whatever, black walnut cracking machine. It's basically like an upscaled version of a peanut cracker with like a cone inside of a cylinder, and it just rotates and squishes the nuts. I'll try to throw some pictures up here. like I said, there's various cooperatives across the country that have some of this equipment. So if you're in a place where you're near one of these cooperatives, I recommend, use them, support them, get your nuts cracked there. And I hope, I'm working towards, I want to see more of this equipment accessible to folks. And so part of that is just trying to get the word out that it exists and that it works well. It would make all of our lives easier for those of us who want to work with walnuts. I know a lot of people who love walnuts, but they don't feel like they have the time or the willingness to put in the work to do it all by hand. And I totally understand that. So that's where this community scale equipment comes in. The other thing is plant selection and breeding. So, native peoples worked with black walnut for thousands of years on this land prior to Europeans coming over. And we cut down a lot of trees and we colonized and genocided those people, and a lot was lost. But over those thousands of years of these people working with black walnuts, they made selections, right? They were working with these trees in an agricultural sense. They really know almost about it. Like, they were working with tree crops. And so there are remnant varieties of black walnut that have a thinner shell and that crack out much easier. Now know how to graft black walnut, and so those varieties can be propagated and planted out. Those varieties, typically they're so easy to crack, you don't need an industrial black walnut cracker. They crack out much easier at home in the little kitchen device. I think it's valuable and important that we continue planting out those varieties, those grafted trees, getting more of these grafted orchards going, as well as planting seedlings from those trees, right? Because we don't want to just be doing grafted trees. We don't want to become susceptible to diseases by only having a few varieties in production. We want to be planting the seedlings of these trees and creating the next generation of, high quality black walnut trees. Been some modest breeding and improvement work done over the past 100 years, by hobbyists and folks at institutions, ag institutions. But like I said, most of the black walnut, cultivars, varieties, whatever you want to call them, the improved black walnut trees that we have today, most of those are remnants of these indigenous cultures. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, talk about that if we're going to talk about these trees, talking about the people who brought them to us and what they went through. Anyway, this video is probably getting pretty long, but, let me know what you guys think. Do you have other questions about black walnuts that I didn't answer? Is there stuff that you want to just hear me talk about more? Any aspects of this that you want to hear more about? I'm happy to elaborate on any of it. I know exactly when I'm going to post this video. It is middle of September as I'm filming it. Typically, and I've been picking up walnuts the past week or so. Typically, sometime around the middle of September, the season starts, but usually the peak is in October. Sometimes there's swings, right? Sometimes there's a lot of walnuts one year, not as much the next year. So this year, we're not seeing very many walnuts on the East Coast, although I know parts of the Midwest are having a lot this year, 2024. So in a typical year, October is going to be the peak part of the harvest. So if you're watching this anytime in October and you have interest, get out there and start looking, there's walnut trees around.